Okay, hello and welcome to Rupture or Continuity, the Internationalization of Gay Identities by Dennis Altman. I was going to do this presentation by drawing a whole lot on the whiteboard, but I can't do that now, so here is what I came up with instead. So first off, I think that we should probably talk about who is Dennis Altman and kind of like the context of when this was written and who he was. So he's an Australian. He grew up in Tasmania and he was born in 1943. He's pretty old now, I suppose. He is a prolific academic and gay rights activist. He's actually published like 13 books about sexuality and gender, so that is loads, obviously. This particular article was written in 1996 and was published in a journal called Social Text, which is kind of a journal that focuses on cultural studies like gender, sexuality, race, and published by Duke University Press in America, which is also a fairly huge publisher of academic stuff in general. But so it was written in the 90s, and so I think it's probably worth considering the context of when that is, like coming off the back or like the end of the AIDS epidemic, and also the beginnings of the internet and like the expansion of that. So keep that in mind. So now I'm going to talk, basically the article talks a lot about like what is the identity of a global gay identity, sort of. In the very like first page or something, he identifies this global gay as young, upwardly mobile, sexually adventurous, with an in-your-face attitude, traditional values, and also with an interest in fashion and activism. So now here is my beautiful drawing that I did. On the left, you'll see that that's the Western world down there, and up in the right-hand corner is the third world. That's actually how he refers to it in the text, but, I think it's probably now known more as developing world. It's important to kind of keep in mind about things that were problematic then or not problematic or whatever. It's 2017, guys. Cool. Yes, in the middle there's if you use your eyes, you can see a common gay identity via globalization, the force of that. So down in the left-hand corner, there's a little capitalist sunnies, which is cool. And then up with the third world, Altman was talking about the spread of gay identity in the non-Western world, and that kind of included a growing amount of commercial establishments catering to gays in increasingly affluent countries like Brazil, Japan, and Thailand. So he said saunas and discos, which were apparently still a thing in 96, which is cool, discos. But so there's a cool bar, there's a hot sauna, also gay and lesbian press, and he mentioned Mexico, Brazil, Hungary, and Hong Kong as kind of like being forerunners in that area, and also the rise of gay and lesbian political groups. So on the one hand of this kind of globalization push, there's kind of arguments that, globalism and consumerism create individualism and greater life choices, but like, as we know, these are linked to Western style identities and identity politics, which I think is really good that Altman pointed that out. On the other hand, it's also just straight up erosion of non-Western cultures. So let's dive into why. Cool. So here we have the spread of Western capitalist globalization, erosion, onto a rich history of homosexualities in the third world. So how does this erasure happen? Well, Western terminology blocks us from accessing different cultural understandings of queerness and sexualities. Terms like gay people, men who have sex with men, bisexual, and transgendered. He actually didn't use transgendered. He said transsexual, which, again, is kind of like probo now. But like he he talked about transgender people, but kind of didn't include that in the list. But so I'm going to anyway. Other ways that erasure happens are romanticizing primitive sexualities or homosexual practices that, you know, and in countries that are seen as more tolerant, but this kind of ignores an entire history of persecution and violence of homosexualities. Also, it's worth noting that much of critical theory and historical analysis derives from the West's very specific experience of modernity, and that is kind of another way that erosion can occur. So down in the rich history of sexualities in developing world, these are kind of different types of sexualities that don't fit into a Western norm or even a definition. There's Indonesian warriors. Sorry for anybody who can speak these languages. Thai, Kathoi. There's also, so this was an interesting part, I thought, in Latin America. There's the activos, passivos, or also known in other parts as the Machisters Koshon. Again, sorry. But so he wrote that in certain Latin American cultures, homosexual identity is related to the rejection of dominant gender expectations. So that, you know, quote unquote, a real man can have sex with other men and not risk his heterosexual identity. Interestingly, he wrote, the nature instead of the object of the sexual act becomes key. A koshon is the receiver in anal intercourse, and he's like, that's a stigmatized role, but his partner is active, the penetrator, and is not stigmatized. Anyway, moving on, Filipino bayot, Polynesian fafine. So I'll attach a really cool video that I watched on Vice about a Polynesian group in Auckland in New Zealand who are kind of like expressing their identities and sexualities in lots of different ways, which is really interesting. Anyway, all of these kind of identities, all like characterize transsexual, those are his words, or homosexual behavior in one form or another, which change with emphasis on gender or sexuality. Which obviously, like, you know, Western tradition doesn't really have much room for movement in that respect. Moving on, Western homosexualities, a history. So this is kind of, a lot of the article is about finding the balance, or indeed like the tension between tradition and modernity. It's really worth pointing out, and I'm glad that he did, that, you know, tradition and modernity are like pretty like vague and contested terms. There's a really good quote that he used, which is, traditional culture is increasingly recognised to be more an invention constructed for contemporary purposes than a stable heritage handed on from the past. So that's really interesting. And I think also the next point is that, you know, previously, before the gay rights movement in the 20th century in the West, a gay act didn't necessarily make you a gay man. There's a good quote from George Schuntzer. The most striking difference between the dominant sexual culture of the early 20th century and that of our own era is the degree to which the earlier culture permitted men to engage in sexual relations with other men, often on a regular basis, without requiring them to regard themselves or be regarded by others as gay. Many men neither understood nor organised their sexual practices along a hetero-homosexual axis. Well, that's fucking interesting. So yeah, again, so in this kind of like pre-gay rights era, in Western cultures anyway, a homosexual man was a man who behaves like a woman, which is obviously, you know, it's a gender confusion and not to do with sexuality. You know, and that's also why to this day we have drag as a gender and sexuality subversion, which is cool. So it's all that. Oh yeah, there's also a good quote, which is, homosexuality is no longer considered an expression of really being a woman in a man's body or vice versa, but rather as physically desiring other of one's own gender without necessarily wishing to deny one's masculinity, femininity. Did I mess up that quote? I don't know. I'm going to move on. I'm going to do this in one take. Well, how exciting. Okay, so that kind of is like bridging the gap between, or like at least talking about that tension between tradition and modernity. So modern homosexuality then is this kind of like emergence of a gay identity, a point in time when gay acts started to mark you as a gay person, and like becoming gay meant like taking on a set and style of behaviours. There's also now a differentiation between sexual and gender transgression, which we were just talking about, and an emphasis on emotional as much as sexual relationships. So gay as, gay feelings, I suppose, as an emotional connection, and not just an erotic one. There was an interesting part where he kind of asked if the lasting homosexual couple is like a hangover of heterosexuality, which is interesting, and I'm not really sure where I stand on it, but he asked, like, is this just a move to enforce patriarchal, hegemonic Western systems of power onto a gay relationship? Is marriage just a hetero mainstream Western tradition? Kind of. Yes, and then lastly, the development of public homosexual worlds, the creation of a gay world, defined socially, commercially, and politically. Moving right along. So the gay communities kind of came into existence, and is a recognised part of most Western industrialised societies. There's also, the gay world reflects the ideology of individual rights and fulfilment. There's a recognition of pluralism and cultural diversity, or at least this is what Altman was saying. And all of these Western ideals may be inappropriate in other settings. A non-Western homosexual is then kind of left to decide what they're going to do with kind of the hegemony of Western patriarchal bullshit. Many non-Western homosexuals are attracted to the Western model upon which they seek to impose their own movements. I thought that was really interesting. Modern homosexuals and traditional homosexuals exist side by side now. This actually wasn't specific whether this was in Western culture or not. Thus, in non-Western cultures, homosexuals might seek continuity, aka like aligning themselves with Western traditional homosexuality, or they might seek to distance themselves from traditional Western forms of homosexuality. And this is just subject to change, kind of. They might align themselves more with a modern idea of Western sexuality, or, there's all these kind of different possibilities come into play. I really thought a key quote for me, in fact, it's so key that I wrote it down in my book, is, in a sense, globalization is capitalist imperialism writ large, and many of its features continue and perpetuate the erosion of custom, of existing kinship and villages and communities, and of once private space in the interests of an expanding market dominated by the first world. What was once accomplished by gunships and conquest is now achieved via shopping malls and cable television. This is a pretty, fashionable thing, perhaps, to, rag on capitalism, but, it's so real. So what to do? That is the question now. And the answer for Altman was know that affluence, education, and awareness all help adoption of new identities in developing worlds, and with travel and tourism, and also just progress, straight up progress, the developing world is getting there, and gay identity will expand its from its base within Western society. That's hopeful. We can talk about whether you think that has happened or not. He recommended, in order to get kind of a holistic view over it, or just to expand the conversation a little bit, which is again important for us to keep in mind in our pretend discussion that we're going to have, except we're just going to have it online instead. Okay, so here's what I've written, or rather what he wrote. In order to get a holistic view, one must consider the importance and influence of history, include female-identifying lesbians and gender non-binary queer people in the equation. Is their experience of a sense of a gay community or identity different? Why and how? A consideration of class/caste divides. That's his specific wording, but I still don't really. Yeah. A consideration of varying family patterns /ways of home living, and the spread/diaspora of homosexuals across the globe. and interactions between developing nations, which again is obviously not something the West knows very much about, or maybe they can't know about it. I don't know. Okay, so these are the questions that you can respond to if you wish. In the 20 years since this article was written, how do you think the development of gay identities in non-Western nations has developed? How has the internet/mass communication influenced this? First question. I think you can probably just respond to any of them or all of them or just the thing in general, anything you found interesting. Okay, is marriage too much of a heteronormative institution to be fitted into the mould of variant and developing sexualities in the West and non-Western countries? And lastly, how has the concept of a global gay identity changed? What constitutes a modern gay identity in 2017? How do we help develop the creation/continuation of specific cultural homosexualities without drenching it in Western thought and custom? So cool bananas. That is my presentation done. Leave a comment, down below.